first of all, I'm going to tell you about Paul Mills, and then I'm going to tell you why we're here. Paul Mills, PhD, is the professor of public health and family medicine, and director of the Center of Excellence for Research and Training in Integrative Health, and the former chief of behavioral medicine at the University of California, San Diego. To give you a little bit more of a clue of why we're here also, he is the director of research for the Deepak Chopra Foundation. So he has published over 400 scientific publications in the fields of pharmacology, oncology, cardiology, psychoneuroimmunology, behavioral medicine, and integrative health. And he published some of the first important research on meditation. And his work has been featured in Time Magazine, the New York Times, National Public Radio, New York News and World Report, Consumer Reports, Huffington Post, Gaia TV, and Web M.D., among many others. And he's presented his work at hundreds of conferences around the world, including at the United Nations. And actually, the reason then that we're here is his new book, Science, Being, and Becoming: The Spiritual Lives of Scientists. And to tell you then who we are the Light on Light Press, which I'm sure you're familiar with. We are an imprint of Sacred Stories. You can find us at lightonlight.us. You can find Sacred Stories at sacredstories.com. And the backstory there is real simple. I think you all know our magazines, which are all free at issuu.com/lightonlight. And after so much success with the magazines and Voice America, Sacred Stories came to us and said, wow, if we could start doing books, we could even get more substantial stuff out there for all you wonderful people. So the reason Paul is an unsung hero, but soon to be sung about a lot, is because, as he'll tell you, he has spent all of these years on this really, really interesting and fascinating and urgent topic about the coming together of science and religion as we start to understand how really important and well-known scientists, once they're able to talk about it, can talk about what their experience has been in this straddle between spirituality and science. So here is Paul, and actually Scott and I are going to take turns asking him about his book. Also want to say that we're so excited that we're in contract with him for a second book, which will build out from his first book. The first book is 30-some neuroscientists talking about this experience. Some of them are really well known. One's up for a Nobel Prize in medicine. And then we're going to be doing in a second book where Paul's going to extend this research out to economics, philosophy, cosmology, evolution, and all the other areas of science. So we're just really excited about this dialogue coming forward in such an important way. So, Paul, the first question that we wanted to bounce off of you was, tell us in your own words, what is this book about?
Thank you, Kurt, for your very kind introduction and all the support you've given me to get this book out there. The book's literally about the spiritual life of scientists. As Kurt said, I interviewed over 30 primarily biomedical scientists, and I interviewed them at length and asked them about their transpersonal, their metaphysical, and their mystical experiences. And these were very intimate conversations. They shared with me their life and experiences, some of the earliest things from when they were in childhood. Some of them had these metaphysical awakenings more when they were adults. And then we discussed how those insights and revelations and really personal transformations altered their scientific trajectory, or for some, how it actually launched them on the scientific path. That's the content of the book, in addition to some of my own stories in there. And also we have some material just on what we could call the consciousness development journey that all of us are on, and that we're all entitled to be on. And it's about really to the spiritual unfoldment of humanity.
Yeah, Paul, thanks so much. And one thing I wanted to mention is what's really amazing about this book is it's not just an anthology. What Paul has done is he's really mapped from all of these discussions with these scientists, what is the whole nature of this straddle? Why has it been so difficult? And what's the nature of why it's taken so long for these two different areas to come together? So that really leads us, Paul, to the second question is, why did you write this book? And we were so excited when you presented it to us. So that's the question. Why did you write it?
Yes, there were a couple of reasons. And the first I'll mention is that at the University of California, where I've been for over 30 years, I got a reputation for being very open to discussing spiritual matters. So I often had students knock on my door and asking if they could speak with me about certain things, of which I was very open. And through time of those conversations, I realized that we need material out there that give young scientists and other people really permission to know that it's okay to get out of the materialistic mindset, to embrace their own spiritual and cosmological development. So that was one reason. But another reason, and really perhaps I could say a bigger reason, and I'm going to share it with you, and it's very relevant to the opening video that you showed, Scott, about the inspiration for this work. And this experience that also led me to the book was an encounter with I'll have to say, a vast cosmological being that shared with me what the future development of humanity is. And this being essentially told me that it had been watching humanity for eons upon eons, tracking our spiritual development. And it was keenly interested in the day when we will ultimately manifest the reason we were created. And it showed me all this through images and, it's kind of a standard telepathic communication. But ultimately, it showed me that in the future, when humanity is advanced enough, humanity will manifest into our physical dimension, often called the third dimension, love. Literally, love will become a physical entity manifestation in creation. And that's what this being is waiting for. And that inspired me to write the book, because I wondered, well, what have I, as a biomedical scientist, been doing to help support this future trajectory of humanity? And then I also wondered, what about other scientists? What are they doing? So I started interviewing people and asked them, what's your spiritual life about? Are you evolving? What's your science doing? How are we helping support the stage for the future evolution of humanity, the current and future?
That's an incredible story of your experience. And thank you for sharing that. And I'm just curious, how has talking to all these other scientists shaped your personal journey? Now, we got a good taste of your personal journey by having this extraordinary experience. How does talking to the others, how is it evolving your personal journey of life?
Yeah, thank you, Scott. It was incredibly inspiring speaking with all these scientists, and how it affected me is it gave me more confidence to just keep moving forward in my own work and in my own spiritual trajectory. It was beautiful to hear them speak and share. And within that sharing, and something I note in the book, it actually filled me with a little bit of regret, because some of the scientists I interviewed, I've known for many, many years. But we always met at scientific conferences, and at those conferences, we're there to discuss science. And all of us had our kind of spiritual, mystical lives in a closet, because it typically is frowned upon to speak about these things. And historically, it can have adverse effects on one's scientific career and academic advancement. And so that's why I'm saying I had a little bit of sadness that I didn't know about the depths of those folks, and nor those I didn't share with them either. So there's that piece. So broadly, it's given me confidence to just keep going and to disseminate this information, which we're doing with this publication with Light on Light Press.
Yeah, and Paul, when we first met, we've done so many things with Deepak, and Deepak is so generous with the evolutionary leaders, and as interested as everybody is across the world to get these two worlds, talking together and experiencing each other in the way that you mentioned. So actually, Deepak Chopra has written the foreword for this book, a really insightful foreword about exactly what Paul's been talking about. And then Ken Wilber, who you all know, Ken Wilber has come in and written a special commentary on the book, which is in the book as well, again, about why this is so important right now. So Paul, that actually leads to the next question is what has been this problem with this false divide between the world of science and the experience of spirituality?
Yeah, I'd say the problem is multifold, multidimensional. Let me speak about the problem for scientists themselves initially. So when the world of the spiritual was sort of closed off as a no place to go for science some centuries ago, and that is a tradition, as all of us know on this call, where scientists generally don't want anything to do with the so-called mystical, the metaphysical, for reasons I said a moment ago. But unfortunately, over the generations, the vast majority of scientists now, I would say, are highly materialistic. They don't even believe the spiritual world exists. They don't believe in things like the mystical. They don't believe that love is a foundation of creation itself. They have no experiential insight into it. To me, that's a very sad thing. So that's one of the primary fallouts of this false divide that was occurred. The other is that we as societies around the world, we look to science to show us what's true, to show us advancements in all things in the world. And essentially, science has been unable and unwilling to do work to show us our deep, innate, historical, mystical nature and where we're heading into the future. It's been off the table. And I'll also add that materialistic sciences, the way they're done, we all know, can lead to many things being developed and created and disseminated that are harmful. They're harmful for us as human beings. They're harmful for the natural world. They're harmful for the earth, not life supporting, certainly not spiritually supporting. So there's another downside and reason why this kind of false divide has to end. And it is ending.
Yeah, Paul, thanks so much. And I'm going to do one more and then throw you back to Scott. But what's interesting is I think many people on this broadcast were surprised that you would open by talking about the direct experience that you had that led you to writing this book, where here you are, a well-known and positioned scientist, and suddenly, because you have this direct experience of, and then you bring that to your world of knowledge about, you're in this really amazing way to express and share the straddle with other people. So what I thought I'd ask is, share with us one of the other stories from the book where you felt a scientist had an extraordinary experience and also reacted that in a way that brought forward this really wonderful straddle between those two dimensions.
Okay, let's see. I've got to go into my archive here. So many fantastic stories, but one pops up. So his name is Dr. William Bushell, and he's a medical anthropologist by training. He had a fascinating story, and basically he spent most of his life, he got his PhD in anthropology, and he was traveling the world studying spiritual traditions of other cultures and other countries. And the interesting thing is, all the while, he actually didn't believe in anything spiritual. He had no spiritual life. He didn't believe it was all true, but he just thought, well, somebody's got to study it. I'll do it. So he traveled the world and he would interview people from different cultures. And what happened to him that awoke him is a beautiful story. And he was home one afternoon. He was in his mid-50s at this point, and he went down to rest. And within a few moments, he essentially had a spontaneous Kundalini awakening. And in this Kundalini awakening, a goddess appeared above him, as he described it. And it's a beautiful description, and I do my best in the book to share it with what he shared with me. And this divine being, he called it the Kini, a goddess appearing to him, and they had this exchange. And amongst one of the most profound after effects of the exchange is this. He understood, he essentially had an experience of what he called, and what is commonly called, imminent divinity. Through that experience, he, for the first time in his life, he absolutely knew and experienced in his whole system himself as a divine being, as well as a human being. That's the imminent divinity. We as humans and our divinity together. And since then, he's been, of course, a transformed person. His work is different. How he approaches his work and how he approaches his everyday living, he said, is now radically different. And that's one of the beautiful stories I had the pleasure of hearing.
Great, Paul. And so I'm going to throw you back to Scott. But what I wanted to mention is that this is exactly the reason that not only are we excited about this book, because everybody, when you read this, these are not just marginal scientists. These are people who are very well positioned, and they finally have permission now to talk about what their experiences have really been. And that's why we're so interested in moving on to the second book, where Paul can talk to people in economics and in philosophy and in cosmology and the evolutionary sciences. And I just wanted to mention, because Brother Phil is on the show, obviously all of you have already seen the nexus here between this type of direct experience and what is actually just completely implicit in the experience of First Peoples and the whole areas of the shamanic arts and the healing arts and shamanism. So this all gets wrapped together. So Scott, over to you to bounce a question off Paul.
Wow. I'm really enjoying this a lot, and it's so what the awakening world is all about. So again, thank you, Kurt, for bringing Paul into our audience. I'm just curious about two possible people you may have interviewed. Jeffrey Colebrook, who's one of our regulars, is wondering if you spoke to Nassim Harriman. And I'm curious if you spoke to Dr. Kenneth Ring, who did all the near-death experience research.
I have not, I'm sorry to say. There's a whole list that we've been compiling for the second book. And I even had other scientists for the first book, but there was only so many we could fit into one book and tell a good story, one that's readable and enjoyable. So book 2.
Okay, great. I definitely will turn you on to Dr. Kenneth Ring if you don't know him. I thought of him just now when you're telling the story about the other scientist who was doing it even though he didn't believe. Same thing. Dr. Kenneth Ring was a clinical psychologist, and he set out to study near-death experiences to prove his theory that it was just the brain shutting down. And after doing comparative analysis and research over 10 years on over 300 people who had had near-death experiences, he had come into a very similar, I think, place where you are of, oh my God, there is this extraordinary divinity, this extraordinary oneness, this extraordinary thing. So anyway, he would be a good one for you. I have a question, and this is a little bit off the ones that maybe you've been asked before, but some of my friends that are in the scientific community have said that there is a growing consensus among some thinkers that the Great Bang took place when a higher intelligence pressed an enter button, if you will. That what we're experiencing, this holographic universe, this experience of life, is actually that God, if you will, is a higher intelligence that created all of this. And that's really what the Big Bang was. And I'm curious if that has shown up with some of your people that you've interviewed, and just kind of your thoughts on that possibility.
Sure. So a couple of things. One of the folks I've interviewed for the second book, Jude Curvin, speaks about this very much so. That's been her experience. She speaks about not the Big Bang, but the Big Breath. I'm not a physicist or a cosmologist, but from my own personal experience, roaming the strata of consciousness, yes, that is my experience. The universe is clearly a conscious being. The universe itself, as we know it, we could call the mind of the Godhead. We are experiences within the Godhead itself. We are these personalized consciousnesses reflecting upon our own existence and everything else, but essentially it's one big living being. And I'd love to see all scientists wake up to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're actually working on a book now with Jude to expand this conversation out, because one of the big issues that comes up in science and just between people of direct experiences is the universe a dead universe, or is the universe actually a living universe that is also sentient? Is it driven by causal source in the way that we understand in the wisdom traditions of God or ideas of source? And what we see so clearly from Nassim's work and Jude's work is that the new cosmology from the new physics helps us understand what they call enfolding, how the universe was created in a way that is not only living, but it's sentient relative to being an entire superorganism of almost imaginable proportions that's so interconnected in how it works and how it drives itself. So Paul, say some more about this book. I want to say people in the chat mentioned Eben Alexander, and Eben is one of the commentaries in the book. So yes. You might give us a little bit more landscape across the book, and then we can see where we're at with Scott, since we certainly don't want to take time from any of our other guests. So this gets so fascinating, we could go on and on. So Paul, tell us a bit more about just the whole landscape of the book.
Okay, so the landscape of the book, as you had mentioned earlier, Kurt, Deepak Chopra wrote the foreword, and Ken Wilber has a special commentary. In addition to the content that I've contributed through the interviews and some other material, we have what are called spotlights in the book, and there are 4 of them. And Eben Alexander did write one of them. And the reason for the spotlights is we wanted to go into greater depth into certain topics that have high relevance to the book itself. So, for example, I asked Eben to write a book based on his own experiences, having been in academia, having an awakening experience. Write an article that can give young scientists and older scientists who have had these experiences and now they need to reorient to their work. They realize through self-revelation, it's not materialistic. I'm more than this body-mind system. I am so much more. How am I going to go forward in my work, into my life with this? So that's what Eben wrote. It's a beautiful spotlight. We have 3 other spotlights, one by Dr. Robert Atkinson, who's also an editor at Light on Light with Kurt. And he wrote a spotlight on the topic of the movement, the natural innate movement of consciousness itself to evolve and evolve and evolve towards greater unity. We have another
one other thing too, before I throw back to Scott. What I found really interesting in reading the book, and it'll parallel everybody's experience about awakening to non-dual consciousness. Some people had these awakenings very incrementally. It's very, very interesting. Others had really catastrophic interventional experiences where out of the blue, this dimension showed up to them. And others had known about it from the time that they were child. The story about Rudy Tanzi, and he would play a game with his sister when they were like in single digit age about disappearing everything. And when they disappear everything, they would actually go into a non-dual consciousness and feel that incredible ecstasy of that connection with everything. So there's so much of a landscape in the book that's just amazing.
Yep. That was a great story. He has several great stories in there, actually.
He does.
I'll just summarize with the final 2 spotlights. One by Professor Dusana Dorjee, and she's in the United Kingdom. She wrote a book on the importance of compassion and the value of compassion meditation as a mechanism, as a quality of our soul that can really help us manage non-dual experiences, how to stabilize them, and how to help forward our spiritual development. And then the other spotlight is written by Professor Markides, who's up in Maine, and he wrote a spotlight on the topic of the historical relevance and importance of metaphysical and mystical experiences. And his work, academic work, he's traveled the world too, studying mystical experiences and metaphysical experiences, understanding them, what they mean to people and how they fit into cultures, religions, philosophy. So his is the first spotlight in the sequence in the book to help set the stage, because some of the early material, people start reading and say, what is this nonsense, metaphysical, mystical? This guy's off his rocker. But the purpose of this particular spotlight is to put it all in a greater context and hopefully be more acceptable and understandable.
Yeah, and I'm going back to Scott now to close this out, but I wanted to mention, if you don't know, Rudy Tanzi is the head of neuroscience at Harvard. But also what was outed about him in this book, because people in this area are multi-talented, he was in the original cast of Aerosmith, of the band Aerosmith. So he's another great polymath. So you musicians out there, get acquainted with Rudolph Tanzi.
That's great. Well, I've been putting it in the chat box. And Paul is clearly he's written quite a few books. But of course, the one we're talking about is Science, Being, and Becoming, the Spiritual Lives of Scientists. It's coming out next month. You can pre-order it here. I've put the link into the chat box. And Dr. Mills, what a beautiful work that you're doing. I am going to order the book right away. And probably invite some of those people to be on the show. Eben Alexander has been on the show before. And thank you for the promotion, because Jude Curvin is our keynote speaker 1 week from tonight. She's been on the show before. She's our keynote speaker next Saturday night. So thank you. You already did a little bit of promotion for us for next weekend. And I would love to continue this dialogue and love to have you come on again, because you're doing just such wonderful, wonderful work.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks for having me on your show. And Kurt, thank you for introducing me and supporting me.